This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I want to give a special thank you to Wes, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon, and to Modi Rudstein, who just signed up to make regular contributions to the show via PayPal. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 450 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing some of our favorite games that were created for the Apple II, which was one of the most popular computers of the 1980s. And I'm joined by two guests. So first up, we've got David Lcraddick, who you may remember from our feature interview back in episode 397. He's written over a dozen books about video games, including Arcade Perfect, Stay a While and Listen, and Rocket Jump. He's also the author of the young adult fantasy novel Heritage, the first book in the Garden Chronicles. And we'll be speaking with him today about his book Breakout, how the Apple II launched the PC gaming revolution. So David, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back. I've been looking forward to it.
And also joining us today is Mark Lemmert. He's a finance and business management consultant, has spent a lifetime playing Apple II role-playing games, and was project leader on the new 8-bit role-playing game Nox Archaist from 6502 Workshop. The game was designed to run on the Apple II, and features cameos from gaming legends such as Richard Garriott, Steve Wozniak, and Jordan Mechner. So Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, so I think the first thing to say on this topic is that I never, unfortunately, ever owned an Apple II. My parents both worked for IBM, so we always had IBM PCs in the house growing up. But I did spend quite a bit of time on Apple IIs at school because, we had a computer lab, and those were all Apple IIs. And then my Uncle Bill had an Apple II, so every time I was over at my grandma's house, I would play games on his Apple II. So the Apple II games that I played a lot at school were like Oregon Trail and Number Munchers. And then over at my grandma's house, I played a lot of Karateka and Lode Runner are the ones I really remember. And so I played a lot of RPGs of this era. So I played Ultima 4 and Fantasy 1 and 2 and Rings of Zilfin. But I played all the PC ports of those. But, I mean, those games were all on the Apple II. And so I think they were fairly similar from what I know. But so let's go to David. What kind of was your personal experience? Did you ever own an Apple II?
I was fortunate. I kind of did and kind of didn't. My grandma was an elementary school teacher. She taught in the reading center, and she kept an Apple II in her classroom. And when I was sick, or when I was quote-unquote sick, I got to go to the reading center with her and spend the day playing games like the Oregon Trail, of course, which is a perennial favorite. Where in the World's Carmen Sandiego. I even had the big almanac, the World Almanac that came with the game, so you could look up answers to the clues. And then when summer vacation hit, she would bring the computer home. So I got to play her entire library of games all summer long.
So were you quote-unquote sick a lot?
Yes, as often as I could be. In fact, in the summer between 5th and 6th grade, when I wasn't sick at all, miraculously, weirdest thing, I took my first programming class, and I did that on the Apple II. I went to a summer school in State Street Middle School, which is where I eventually went to middle school, and it was awesome because I would spend the day, writing code in BASIC, and the novelty of like making my own games, making things happen on the screen because I made them happen was really cool. But then afterwards, while we were waiting for parents to come pick us up, I would play Lemonade Stand, which is still one of my favorite Apple II games to this day.
Yeah, I played that as well. It's a game where you have your own lemonade stand and you decide how many stands there are going to be and where they're going to be positioned and how much you're going to charge for lemonade and stuff like that. And it teaches kids to be entrepreneurs.
It did, although I think I got a little carried away with it because, like a lot of kids, I ran a lemonade stand and I was sitting there out on the sidewalk outside my grandparents' house thinking, I'm charging a quarter, but in this game I have it up to $200 a glass. What am I doing wrong here?
See, how about Mark? What were you? Does this sound familiar? The kind of experiences we're talking about here?
Oh yeah, definitely. I've played most of the games that you both mentioned, and I got into the Apple II really very young age. I was like 5 years old, and my dad bought an Apple II. I had a couple older brothers, and so we got an Apple II in the house. I think in 1980, early end of the 80s, and this was like an Apple II Plus. But I can remember sitting watching my brothers play games because I was really too young for most of the games at first, and I can remember watching them play Ultima and things like that. And at the time, I could only play things like Lemonade Stand, and that was what I was allowed to do. But that was kind of where my interest in role playing games and programming was born. And you mentioned Oregon Trail earlier too. I definitely spent a lot of time playing that, mostly at school, because that was like the game that the schools had. Every school seemed to have an Apple II somewhere in the building, and there was always a copy of Oregon Trail. And so I played that a lot at school. Died of dysentery many times, as is tradition.
Yeah, well, and David, that's something you talk about. I just read your book, Breakout. And I mean, I definitely had the sense that pretty much everyone of a certain age played Oregon Trail in school. But I hadn't realized just how popular it was. But I guess, pretty much every school had Apple IIs, and there were only like 10 games at the time. And so pretty much everyone played all the same games. But I think you said Oregon Trail had sold like 65 million copies. It was something unbelievable like that.
Yeah, it was an absurd number. And the interesting thing is, none of our cases were atypical. The cool thing about the Apple II is that even though it came out in 1977, it got this second, third, and fourth wind because it was in most classrooms until the early 90s when the Macintosh kind of took over. The Mac came out in 1984, but it takes time to move all these machines into schools and have them like phase out old hardware. And so it was, I know in my elementary school, we not only had a computer lab with, I think maybe 10 or so Apple IIs, but each teacher had at least one Apple II in the classroom, and you'd have kids rushing through in-class assignments to be the person at the keyboard while playing Oregon Trail. Everyone else just had to stand around and hope that the suggestions they pitched were listened to, because you wanted to be behind the wheel.
Well, I guess I never thought about it before, but I never knew that Oregon Trail was actually made by teachers. And initially it was just, these teachers thought it would be an interesting way to teach this like week-long history module that they had to teach. And then it kind of, snowballed from there.
Yeah, and so one of the things I did with Breakout is for the first, I think I want to say 3 chapters, I wrote about games that they did not originate on the Apple II, but they were popularized on the Apple II. Oregon Trail was a text-only game programmed on a mainframe, and students at the school where the teachers made this played Oregon Trail by using dumb terminals connected to the mainframe. And the interesting thing there is they said that the game ended up teaching the students lessons they did not anticipate. For example, since there were no graphics, you couldn't just press keys to shoot the bison as they'd lumber across the screen. You had to type in bang or pow or whatever the word was. And students became faster typists. They also worked on their spelling. And so I think the main lesson overall with games like Oregon Trail and Carmen Sandiego is that they didn't feel like games, and I don't think a lot of edutainment games that were made on later generations of hardware necessarily captured that. You were still having fun, and you were learning these things subconsciously more than consciously.
I think you mean to say they don't feel like education.
Oh, they don't feel like education. They definitely felt like games. That's what I meant. Yes, for sure.
Oregon Trail, I thought, was particularly good at fooling you into thinking that you were playing a game and not really learning something. Whereas some of the other software the schools had that was like, how to conjugate verbs. It was like, they're not fooling anyone. We know we're learning this is not fun.
Yeah, no video game has the word conjugate in it unless I'm supposed to be learning something.
Yes, exactly.
I thought it was so interesting, too, that one of these teachers, he had gone through all these books of pioneers and things and tabulated how often somebody died or how often somebody got dysentery or the wagon tipped over fording the river or whatever, and then made the game match those percentages. And so if you played Oregon Trail and you know how often you die, like that's how often people were actually dying, doing that Oregon Trail.
Yeah, it was on the same level of a historical novel. Obviously there's some creative license involved, but the more you can root it in history, I think the more engrossed in the quote unquote world, as gamers say today, or the universe, you get. You can kind of, again, it's another way to just assimilate these facts, and they feel like part of the game experience the whole time.
Yeah. See, so Mark, in your bio, you mentioned that you've played role-playing games. Was role-playing games specifically, was that like the main thing you were interested in playing on the Apple II?
That's what I spent the most time playing. I definitely did branch off from that from time to time. Like Oregon Trail, I don't know if you'd exactly consider that a role-playing game, or certainly not a typical one. I also played the first-person shooter game, Castle Wolfenstein, on the Apple II. Spent a lot of time playing that. So, but yeah, role-playing games was definitely where my passion was.
Yeah, well, so I mentioned the games I really played a lot were Ultima 4, Fantasy 1 and 3, and Rings of Zilfin. Did you ever play any? I mean, you must have played Ultima 4. Did you play those other ones?
I did not play Rings of Zilfin, but I played Ultima 2 through a little bit of 7. So definitely you mentioned, I think, Ultima, was it 3 and 4 you said?
I played 4, yeah.
You played 4, okay, yeah. Yeah, I spent a lot of time playing 4. And, at the time, as you know, I mean, we didn't have that many games, and an Ultima title would come out like once every 2 or 3 years or something. So, the Ultima 4 is the kind of game where, yep, I played that constantly pretty much until Ultima 5 came out years later. So it's a lot of time to invest in one game.
Yeah, well, it was really striking. My girlfriend's about 10 years younger than I am. And when when we first met, she had a bunch of roommates and they were all really into video games. And they would have like on their calendar, like this game's coming out on the 15th. And then I'll have 3 days to play that before this game comes out on the 20th, and it was just so much different from, when I guess probably all of us were growing up where,
yes.
You might play one game for 3 years, because there was nothing else really that you liked as much as that one game.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very different, and I think it's very much affected. It's changed the way that people play games, and therefore the way game designers make them. That difference in availability. Yeah.
So, were you doing the whole creating your own adventure journal and drawing your own maps and all that kind of stuff?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I've got reams of graph paper from old maps that I made playing the role playing games. On the Apple II in the 80s, and that was a lot of fun. And I've gone back and revisited some of them as an adult, and redid the maps basically because that was part of the fun.
Yeah, you mean you already had a map that you could have pulled out of a drawer and looked at, but you're like, nope, I'm not using that. I'm drawing my own map again for the first time.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's hardcore. That's what we like to hear.
Totally.
Did you ever, like in David's book, there are a bunch of other role-playing games that he kind of highlights. So like Colossal Cave Adventure, Zork, Wizardry, Bard's Tale, Wasteland. Did you ever play any of those?
Yes, I played, of those, I played Wizardry and Bard's Tale, and very much enjoyed those. And I think really, from my perspective, Ultima, Bard's Tale, and Wizardry were just hugely foundational role-playing games of the day, and most others trace their roots back to those in one way or the other, and definitely a lot of fun with those. Yeah,
David, were you into those role-playing games as well?
I didn't get to experience them until after the fact, because since I interacted with Apple IIs either in a classroom or, in my grandmother's case, as someone who spent most of her time in the classroom and brought her home, I had mostly educational games. But I did get to play, I think in middle school we still had Apple IIs, and someone, we started bringing in games from home and trading them like baseball cards. And I did get to play, I think it was Ultima 3. And I didn't realize it at the time, but that game was this watershed moment for not just RPGs, but games, because it introduced morality. And, looking back, it was pretty simple. Like
Ultima 4.
Ultima 4 did. Yes, Ultima 4. I think I played 3. I must have played 4 later. Maybe that was in high school because we still had Apple IIs then. But I thought it was cool. Looking back, it was kind of simple. You go into a shop like, okay, am I going to steal the sword or pay for the sword? But it was this really big deal that I, realized as I wrote Breakout that sent these ripple effects through later role-playing games, which deal increasingly with moral decisions.
Yeah. Well, no, I've talked about this a lot on the podcast, but yeah, I was a huge fan of the Ultima games, and really like the 8 virtues, which is the sort of ethical system in those games, was really became almost like my personal code and stuff like that. So yeah, they were just hugely formative for me. I don't know, Mark, did the 8 virtues make an impression on you?
Yeah, it was definitely, I think it made an impression on me for the biggest impression on me from a game design standpoint. I have heard stories of some people saying how, Ultima 4 kind of taught them right from wrong to some extent and changed, their life in certain ways. I've heard stories like that. For me, I think it was more, I was seeing it from a game design standpoint of like, okay, this is very different than Ultima 3, Ultima 2, Ultima 1, or Wizardry Bard, so anything else that was happening at the time. And I found it really interesting from that standpoint. And, different people had different reactions. I know one of my brothers that probably played Ultima the most out of all of us, he reacted very negatively to it. He was like, what? They make you be good? You can't steal things and destroy towns? Forget it, I'm not playing it. It was a totally different reaction from him. And but yeah, I definitely enjoyed that aspect of the game with the virtues and kind of figuring out just almost kind of like, what am I supposed to be doing here? What's the goal of the game was a little bit elusive. And part of that comes from I was playing without a manual and, other trinkets and, how such a circumstance would come up. I have no idea, but I wasn't. And Ultima 5, I had the manual and all the stuff. But so I was a little bit, lost kind of trying to figure it out because it didn't have a conventional, you do this and that, and here's the ending, to it. So that made it a little bit challenging in a different way, just kind of figuring out what the end goal was.
Yeah. Did you beat any of the, because like I played Ultima 4 for a long time and never really got anywhere in it. I did beat Ultima 6 and 7, but only because I picked up the hint guide. There's no way I ever would have made it through those without that. So I'm just curious, did you complete any of those Ultima games?
I completed Ultima 3 and Ultima 5 and Ultima 6 when I was playing them when they, around the time they came out. Ultima 4, I have to admit, did stump me. I got within the, a stone's throw of completing it, but I just couldn't figure out some of the puzzles down at the bottom of the abyss where, the final dungeon of the game. And eventually Ultima 5 came out and, I just started playing that. It was only in modern times that I went back to Ultima 4, picked it up and played it all the way through to the end. And I did have to get a couple hints for those puzzles. The same ones that stumped me as a kid stumped me again. And I had to go look up the answers to some of the stuff at the end. But yeah, that was a lot of fun.
Well, because I had that reminds me, I had this experience playing Rings of Zilfin, which I never beat, and I'm still kind of mad about that because I put so much time into that game. But, so like after playing for months or years, I don't even know, I got up to the last boss. And they used to have hint lines where you could call up the company and ask them what to do. And I'm like, I'm at the last puzzle. I just can't figure out what to do. And the woman says, oh, you have to type in submit thy ring. And I'm like, okay. So I try that and then it doesn't work. And I call back and she's like, you have the ring, right? And I was like, no, I don't have the ring. And she's like, oh. And it's like, that's something you're supposed to do like at the beginning of the game. And you have like one save slot in the game. So I never beat Rings of Zilfin.
That's funny. A friend of mine, when we were growing up playing Ultima 4 in the 80s, he tried the Richard Garriott helpline once. He went to, I think it was Gem Con in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And Richard Garriott was there promoting probably Ultima 5 at the time. And so my friend bought the game and got a nice autographed copy from Richard Garriott and asked him, it's like, I can't figure out the word in Ultima 4. Can you tell me what it is? And Richard didn't actually tell him. He said, well, go talk to like the mage in the village cove or something. And, he'll tell you if you have the word correct. And trying to still leave some challenge there. And so my friend gets back and we're like, oh, okay, at least we got this hint. and we still couldn't figure it out.
Well, I think I think it's Ultima 5, like the computer they misspelled one of the words in the program. So like, it's like basically impossible to beat the game if you don't know what the misspelled version of the word you're supposed to type in is.
There was an issue like that in Ultima 4 with one of the clues that exactly was a spelling issue and just impossible to get past.
Yeah. Well, that's reminding me, David, in your book, there was this funny story about Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle emailing, I guess, the creators of Zork when it was running. I don't know if do you remember that off the top of your head?
I don't remember that off the top of my head, no. Yeah.
So, I mean, basically the story was that these are two, well-known science fiction authors, but they were playing Zork in the early days, and they would email the students who had created it, to ask for hints or like give their thoughts or whatever. And they would they were doing this over successive evenings, and each evening they would start drinking and start playing the game. And so their emails got progressively more like belligerent and or incoherent, throughout the evening. And he says one time Jerry Pournelle like emailed some angry thing and then emailed like 5 minutes later and it's like, I'm sorry I said that. I didn't mean that. It's just really funny.
It is. That's also, it's almost like a hallmark of early game designs. I mean, I think the first 3 King's Quest games had parts where if you didn't pick up a certain item or do a certain event at the beginning, you could still get to the end, but you couldn't finish, and you also couldn't go back. It was just something that designers had to learn how to weed that stuff out as they taught themselves how to make games.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly, I got burned really bad with one of those in King's Quest 4, for sure.
Oh.
You know what I'm talking about, the lamp and the dwarves.
And yeah. I think it happened to me in King's Quest 1, which kind of soured me on the series for a long, long time.
Yeah. I mean, but, and I've, obviously I'm a huge fan of Ultima and Richard Garriott and everything. And I've read, multiple books about Origin and everything. But even so, it never really like sunk in until I read Breakout, just what a family business Origin was in the early days. And like, I never imagined that, I have a quote here, but like when, I think it was Ultima 3 sold 100,000 copies. And Richard Garriott says, it's not easy to produce 100,000 of anything in your garage, and like his whole family was basically, making these games in the garage, and he had a shrink wrap machine and all this kind of stuff was just in their house. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really interesting how the games industry is cyclical. You had a similar experience when smartphone and tablet games started taking off, and eventually, that sort of setup just was no longer viable. But you think about how, just as a family, as like a 3 or 4 person operation, that's a lot of money for just a few of you. And of course, most of it rested on Richard's shoulders, but it was just an interesting time that few people get to experience.
Well, because I had heard him talk about, that he would write games himself and then copy them himself onto 5.25-inch diskettes and put them in a plastic bag and take them down to the local computer store and say, would you put this on sale for me? And I didn't realize how common that was, but reading your book, it was like everyone was. I mean, that's the story of so many of these game designers and even companies of this era, was they started out just putting games in plastic bags and going down to their local computer store and saying, would you sell this? And the store owner is like, yeah, this is as good as anything else we've got for sale. Why not?
Yeah, and there were also some variations. I don't know if I mentioned this in Breakout or in Stay a While and Listen, because both of those stories involve Brian Fargo, the head of the company that made Wasteland and Bard's Tale, but he would use guerrilla marketing, where when he had his first game, I think it was an Apple II game, it was an adventure game, he would call the store, ask for the game, they wouldn't have it, and he would act really upset. And then he would call back like 5 minutes later and say, oh, my name is Brian Fargo. I'm selling this game. And the store would go, oh, we've been getting so many calls about that. We would love to stock that. And just really kind of cool oblique angles to get your games onto shelves or onto pegboards, as it were, back then.
That's awesome.
Well, so Mark, David mentioned that he was programming games. Were you programming games as a kid or anything?
Yes. Yeah, I started learning programming about the same time as I started playing games, again, largely because I had some older brothers that were doing both, so I could look over their shoulder as they were learning AppleSoft on the Apple II and so forth, and was able to just kind of start fiddling around with it. But it very quickly, my hobby emerged into one of, I was playing these role-playing games, but I would kind of oscillate between that and trying to write a role-playing game, and I went back and forth for years doing that.
Did you ever think about publishing a game or anything?
Being as young as I was, I never really put that much thought into what would happen if I actually succeeded. And in part because I never really got all that close. Mostly what I was doing was, working on a game engine, without even really understanding the concept of what a game engine was. I never really got to the stage of adding content, and I kept starting over. Partially because I was learning programming. So by the time I would get, certain ways in, I would realize, if I started over, I could do it a different way that would be so much better. And so as a result, I never really came anything close to finishing anything as a kid.
Yeah, I mean, because I spent a ton of time as a kid programming games, and especially role-playing games and things. But but I was programming like in BASIC and Pascal. And so I would always get to a point where just the language, it was too slow, or there was some memory limit or something, and I would get frustrated and move on to something else. But
Sure.
So actually, so reading Breakout, I was kind of like, oh yeah, there's actually, you would have to like be clever about programming the game to run fast or to not use too much memory or things like that. I never got to that stage of mastery.
And there was nothing to guide a person, at that point, the average, kid playing with their Apple II, reading, Nibble magazines or just the literature that was available, which wasn't much. There wasn't really anything that mapped this out, like, okay, if you want to make a game, here's what, like a substantial game, here's what you need to do in order to make best use of the memory and make it fast enough and all these different things.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly remember when I was a kid, there would be these like 900-page books where it's like the ultimate guide to programming games or something like that. And you would read the first couple pages and then it would say like, okay, let's start with a simple program. And then the simple program is like 100 times more complicated than anything I could possibly understand. And then it's like, okay, now that we've mastered that, let's move on to something more complex. And then there's like, you're like, like, obviously these books are not honestly, not genuinely written for new kid programmers. I guess, David, how far did you ever get with any of your game? How far did that go, the programming that you did?
I was actually on the computer science track through college. I started programming when I was around 10, and I largely learned BASIC and C, then C++, just from studying books and eventually getting access to websites like Programmer's Heaven, where people would help you out. You would paste in a snippet of code or a function or a class, and people could help you figure out what wasn't working or optimize it. And I got pretty far, but I had a bad experience in college. I was one of those kids probably everyone hated secretly, but I knew a lot more than my teachers did. And I didn't throw that in their face, but I was just kind of frustrated because I got to a point where I felt like they were leaning on me to guide the class. And I thought, you're being paid for this. I am paying you. I'm not really learning a lot. And I loaded up on credit hours, but at the same time, I would take writing and literature courses just to kind of relax. And I just got to a point where I was talking to my girlfriend, now wife, and said, I think I'm just going to pursue writing, because programming, I'm just kind of burnt out and it's not fun anymore. But I can still, I think I bring to my books the perspective of someone who I've certainly never done anything of the scale of a Nox Archaist or any other game, classic or contemporary, but I kind of understand a little bit of what it's like to be in the trenches and to work with this stuff and try to bring that perspective to the stories that I write about it.
What was the process like of writing Breakout? Like, how did you decide to write an Apple II book?
I was at, I guess it would have been Books A Million, and I was browsing their computer section, and I found a book about, I don't remember what it's called, like the 100 best NES games ever made, and I picked it up like, well, I'm going to just argue with this right off the bat. And a card fell out, and I picked it up, and it said, hey, this is, a Schiffer Publishing book. We're looking for authors. If you have a pitch, send it to us. And on the drive home, I thought, that book looked pretty cool. It was a hardcover. I haven't had a hardcover book come out yet. What could I write about? Oh, I love Apple II games, and no one's really written about how those are made. I'd done Stay a While and Listen and Dungeon Hacks, which is a book about roguelike RPGs. And when I got home, I sat down, and over like an hour, I put together this proposal for Breakout, which I think first was called Insert Disc. And then 2 days later, they said, hey, we want to do this. Let's talk advances. And I was like, oh, shit, I have to write this now. And that's kind of how it started. It was originally going to be like a 50-chapter book with a little bit about each game and its historical relevance. But then I thought, what I like to do is I like to talk to developers and learn how they actually did what they did. So the only criteria I set for myself was I'm not going to write about any game unless I can talk to the person or persons who made it, because I don't want to end up just regurgitating Wikipedia articles. And it just kind of evolved from there.
Well, it's I think you said it's a hardcover book. I mean, it's really like nice paper and full color pictures throughout and all sorts of, covers and advertisements and news clippings kind of things. So, I mean, they must have felt that there was a pretty good market for a book about the Apple II. I mean, to put all this production values into this book.
They did. They were pretty excited about it because by that point, I pitched it in the spring of 2015 and it came out in September 2017. But by the time they accepted my proposal, several other books like Walter Isaacson's Steve Jobs biography, Masters of Doom by David Kushner, both of which were huge influences on me. Those books had come out and proven that there was an interest in not just books about the history of games and tech, but narrative style books where readers can not get too caught up in the nitty gritty of code and things like that, but follow quote unquote characters. And it's the stories of people setting out to build things, to kind of make it, to hustle, are very relatable. And I just happen to write about people who do that with video games and technology. And the cool thing about all of the pictures and concept artwork, illustrations, and so forth I included was all of those came from, Richard Garriott, Brian Fargo, Jordan Mechner. I mean, everyone I talked to thought it was a really cool idea and sent me a ton of stuff. I had a hard time deciding what to leave out more than I had decided what could go in.
Well, no, it's a terrific book. And I mean, like I said, and it really captures that era so well. And I'm a little too young. Like when I was growing up, it was like just after most of the stuff you're talking about, because most of the characters in the book were sort of 10 to 20 years old when the Apple II came out. Mm-hmm. So I just personally experienced sort of the echoes and reverberations of most of the events that you talk about, which were sort of like 77 to 83 or something. But it just captures that era so well. So I think it would be interesting even if you have no experience, because like you say, because it's the story of these people and what they did.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And that's always something I try to do. I like to write my books so that they have two layers. The first is that if people are into video games or a certain designer, then they'll pick it up and they'll probably enjoy it. But I always like to ground each story in personal struggles so that people who might go into it not having played those games or maybe not even really interested in video games or having no experience with the Apple II will kind of get caught up with it. And what really resonated about it for me, what made me think it was a good idea was on that drive home from the bookstore, I thought about Prince of Persia, which I was born in 1982, so I didn't even really start playing Apple II games until like 89 or 90 when it was long since heading into retirement. And the first time I played Prince of Persia was on a Mac. A friend and I, his dad took us to Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego live, or in the USA, whichever was the kids show, the live show. And on the way back, he took us to a Comp USA as a treat, and we saw Prince of Persia running on a Mac on an end cap. And I didn't even realize that Prince of Persia started on the Apple II. And I remember playing that while I wrote Breakout. I downloaded an Apple II emulator and found the Prince of Persia image and thought, I cannot believe the game looks just as fluid on the Apple II. That is incredible. And it makes me think about how consoles today, I was lucky enough to snag a PlayStation 5 at launch, and there aren't a lot of games for it or the Xbox Series X yet. people are mostly playing games from the last generation. And that's kind of always been the case. I realize, a lot of people played Prince of Persia on a Mac or an IBM PC, but in fact, it was a quote unquote last gen game. Some things, the more things change, the more they stay the same, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I played a little bit of Prince of Persia, and it's the same designer, Jordan Mechner, as Karateka, which I played a lot. But and both of those games for the time were visually unbelievable. You just couldn't believe how good they looked, but were freaking impossible. Like they're so hard. And you make the point in the book, I think, that if the games weren't because of the disk space and memory limitations and everything, if you made an easy game, you would beat it in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So you had to make an impossible game so that people would like play the same level over and over and over and over again. And I want to get Mark back in here. So Mark, you must have experienced just how punishingly difficult these Apple II games could be.
Definitely. And at the time it was all that I knew. So I didn't, think of it as the way that I, do now kind of putting it in perspective and seeing how some of the reasons why the designers did it that way, which you've commented on, and also how it's changed. And at the time, as kids, we had or most of us had way more time than as adults to play these games, and as a result, could get through some of those challenging puzzles eventually. I mean, if you put a year into something, it's which oftentimes was switching back and forth between different games and eventually starting over and coming in with fresh ideas and things like that. But whereas now that that's just not viable, and even for kids nowadays, there's so many games to choose from. It just doesn't make any sense to spend a year trying to solve one particular game when there's dozens and dozens and hundreds of others that you could be playing. And so I think that's also part of the reason that we've seen that kind of shift in the way games are designed.
Did you ever play Karateka?
Yes.
Yeah. Because my dominant memory of Karateka is, there's a part where you're trying to fight through all these guards to get to this, like, I don't know, samurai warlord kind of guy. And he has this blue hawk that he sends to attack you. And it just like flies at you relatively slowly. And all you have to do is punch it to get it to fly away from you. But the timing is so finicky that just over and over again, you're just like, oh, and the bird's just like, rah, 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 and scratches at your face and flies off. And it's so frustrating. Oh my God.
And I remember the amount of time that it took me to figure out that I needed to punch it instead of kick it. I mean, that's a whole set of time right there, just figuring out you need to punch. And then, like you said, you got to do it so precisely. If you're just sitting there trying stuff, it's going to take a while to figure out the punching is the right way to do it, because it doesn't, like you said, it doesn't even, you have to do it really precisely. So yeah, that was an interesting one. Or also at the end where you finally beat the samurai lord and you go into the room with the princess, and if you just walk up to her, she kicks you in the face and kills you. I imagine you probably remember that. And it took me a while to figure out that, I need to run towards her in order to finish the game.
I had forgotten. Honestly, I had forgotten. But like reading David's book, because he goes into that in the book, was bringing back all this stuff. Like, there's like a gate that comes down and kills you in one shot, and then the princess kills you in one shot. Like, there's all, and then you could have put like, an hour into, fighting past all these guys and everything, and then and then you die in this completely very, very hard to predict way right at the end there. Oh man,
definitely.
But so what was, tell us, Mark, so have you been playing Apple II games all these years, or did you kind of get back into it at a certain point?
I definitely had a hiatus. I was doing it probably up through the mid-90s, and then, things obviously at that point were taken off on the IBM PC and compatible platform. And I got back into it, I would say probably around 2014, so what was that, 6 years ago? And it was just one day I decided, well, I'm going to buy a Apple II on eBay and, start playing some of the old games that I remember. That'll be fun. And it actually wasn't that random. If I recall, I moved into a place where I had enough room that I could set up another desk with an Apple II without it interfering with my other home office stuff. So that I think kind of triggered it. But yeah, that was really fun, and it really just snowballed. I didn't really know what I was going to do with it from there. If I was just going to play a little bit or what. But no, it's started playing some Castle Wolfenstein, and that led to replaying Ultima, replaying Bard's. I just started going through all the the usual titles that I had enjoyed as a kid.
And I gather there's still a pretty active Apple II sort of fan community. Were you plugged into that at all?
Eventually, I became plugged into it after I started developing Nox Archaist. But at first, when I kind of got back into Apple II and gaming, at that point, I had really no idea that there was an active Apple II community out there. I knew obviously people were selling some stuff on eBay, but I didn't really think anything of that. Maybe they're just cleaning out the closet. But eventually, I found that there's actually like thousands of people worldwide that are still actively doing things with Apple IIs, and even a annual convention in Kansas City, Missouri, called Kansas Fest that has been held since sometime in the 1980s, and has actually been held every year since. It just, the rest of the world moved on to Mac and IBM PCs, but they never did.
Well, I mean, David, you want to talk about that? Because you certainly talk about that in your book.
Yeah, it's interesting that, for me, one of my favorite PC games is Doom, and the Doom community never really stopped. And then every time I look up a book about classic games, I realize, there's still people out there making these games, and a lot of people they'll make something for fun. Like I recently wrote a book about Microsoft's early years in PC game publishing up to and through the launch of the original Xbox. And so one of the people I spoke with was Ed Fries, former vice president of game development at Microsoft. And he said just for fun, he made Halo on the Atari 2600. And he was also kind of surprised that there's a community active for that. And then when you reached out to me about this panel and told me about Nox Archaist, I thought, all right, I'm going to look this game up. I didn't hear about it. And I saw the first screenshot, Mark, and I was like, oh man, I'm getting Ultima vibes from this. But I wonder and then I scrolled down, I'm like, oh my goodness, there are feelies. They have, the map and all those collectibles. And I was like, see, that's the extra mile, right? Like a lot of people still develop, games for classic systems, but I feel like part of the total package back then was you get this really big box once you moved on from Ziploc baggies and note cards with diskettes. And then you get the cloth map, you might get figures, you'd get a nice manual and a hint book. And I think that's what really excites me about these communities still being active, is these are people who obviously know that the games go beyond the games, and there's all this other stuff associated with that time and that era that people are nostalgic for, and that it's still fun to discover for the first time. You realize, oh gee, Steam is convenient, but I kind of miss all this cool stuff that used to come with games.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that the maps and everything in the manuals for Ultima just made it so magical, and a lot of that was just because of the disk limitations and stuff. They just couldn't put all the text in a lot of these early games, like you talk about with Wastelands. You just needed a book because that was a way to get more text as part of the game experience. But yeah, I mean. Yeah, all those feelies and maps and everything. I don't know. I mean, Mark, you must talk about what that meant to you.
Yeah, it's a quintessential part of a role-playing game to me. And I bought Ultima 5 as a kid, waited like 4 weeks for UPS to deliver, ordering it out of a magazine or something, not the way it works anymore, of course, but at the time, and the box arriving, in the mail and opening it up and, reading through the manual. I was the kind of person where I would read the manual before playing the game. Yes. And I just love those cloth maps and was so immersive. And so that was, that was my experience with it as a kid. And so when I set out to make Nox Archaist, that was always in the back of my mind, was like, well, if I'm going to do this, I should really, really do it all the way and, get the box and the feelies. And obviously that eventually worked out. And even though the game does come in a box and plays on an Apple II. We're actually launching on Steam on January 28th. Will be the first Apple II game ever on the Steam platform. It's, of course, the Windows and Mac version of the game, and we couldn't actually get the box of Feelies somehow inserted into the Steam environment. But for those that just want to play the game and enjoy it on a modern platform, can't be easier than that to be able to jump in Steam and do it.
Well, let me say, too, about the map, because it's an interesting story. And I'd forgotten some of the details until I just read David's book again. But so Richard Garriott saw Time Bandits, the Terry Gilliam movie, in which there's this magic map that shows you where the different time-space portals are. And he's like, oh, my next game, there's got to be a map like that. And so he had, he approached like 8 publishers and said, I want to put a map in my next game. And like 7 of them just walked away right there. And then the one that didn't was Sierra. And so then he published Ultima 2 with Sierra. And then I guess there were issues, and that led him to walk away from them and start his own company. But I've heard him say that like every single company that he approached to produce the maps, it proved to be such a nightmare for them that they didn't want to work with them again. And so he had to find a different company to do every map for every different game in the Ultima series.
This seems to be a constant in game development too. Like back then, one reason a lot of publishers didn't want to touch that sort of merchandise was because it was so expensive to make and to distribute. And, it's funny because digital games are relatively inexpensive to sell compared to physical products, but you still pay full price for them. So I think companies probably get a larger markup for that. But it's also it's damn convenient. I mean, I know that any computer I log into on Steam, I can access my whole library from there, but there's still, like Mark said, I mean, he hit the nail on the head. That's part and parcel with that community and with that era. You need the feelies. And I think for true collectors, you go for that because you just want to have that on your shelf.
Yeah. Okay. So let's lay this out a little bit more clearly. So Mark, you buy your Apple II and you play through all the Ultima games and everything. And at some point, tell us about when you got serious about making Nox Archaist.
Sure. So after playing through the usual games, I got a book on 6502 assembly language, and the original reason I got it wasn't really related to making a game. There was something I was tinkering with that I was trying to figure out. But by the time I got done reading the book, I thought, I can see how to make the game I always wanted to make as a kid in assembly language, which is, of course, the key to getting a game to run fast enough on an 8-bit platform, is using something like assembly instead of BASIC or Pascal. So that really just rekindled the desire at that point, and I started to basically code up little prototype things in assembly that would be foundational to a Ultima style tile-based Apple II game engine, and then eventually contacted one of my friends that I played Ultima with back in the 80s and said, hey, here's what I'm tinkering around with, what do you think? And, so we ended up kind of joining forces to kind of get the project off the ground, and it eventually just kind of snowballed once we formally announced it in the Apple II community. It garnered a lot of interest, and eventually other people contacted me that were interested in being involved, that had a particular skill that they did something much better than me, like art, sound, for to name two, and yeah, it really just took off from there.
Yeah, and so the game is very clearly modeled on Ultima 5. Like the overworld map looks a lot like Ultima 5. The conversation system, the combat system, the dungeons are overhead rather than first person. I guess could you talk about some of those? So what's distinct about this from Ultima 5 in terms of the game mechanics and engine?
Sure. So really, what the mission of the project was to see what might have happened if development on RPGs had continued on the Apple II platform past the end of the 1980s and early 90s when the world moved on to Macs and PCs. And that was a decision that game studios made to switch to Mac and PC based on obviously where the market was moving. But I always wondered, could there have been another iteration to a game like Ultima on the Apple II that pushed it further? Maybe not something quite on the level of Ultima 6, because that was obviously their first title that was not on the Apple, but something somewhere in between Ultima 5 and Ultima 6. I wanted to find out, was that possible? And as a result, I proceeded down the path of basically standing on the shoulders of giants to make sure that the gameplay functionality of Nox Archaist was on par with Ultima 5, but where I could try to push the boundaries beyond. And I largely was successful in doing so. And some of the things that came about from that are pop-up windows. The game has got a full screen, nearly full screen map, and you manage your inventory and merchant transactions and things like that are done in windows that pop up on the screen and overlay, sometimes multiple windows overlaying over the map. With that comes kind of just an overall menu-driven interface where Ultima had probably 24 different keyboard commands, and Nox Archaist has kind of a subset of those commands that'll feel very familiar if you played Ultima, but a whole bunch of the keyboard commands went away because you manage your characters and your inventory and buying and selling from merchants through a menu-based system. And then there were a few, kind of ancillary things aside from that, like swimming. You can actually go swimming in rivers and even into the ocean a little bit in Nox Archaist, or mobs or monsters. And typical in the 8-bit style games, you'd have a mob or monster that was the size of one tile, like 14 by 16 pixels. And in Nox Archaist, we decided to see, well, would it be possible to make a 4-tile monster so that when you encounter a dragon, it's just huge and towering, relative to the size of your character. And that was something that worked out. And there were those are some examples, but there's a whole bunch of different little but noticeable things like that give Nox Archaist its own personality, as well as pushes the boundaries forward in terms of what where Apple II gaming had left off.
Yeah, well, let me talk about the 4 tile things, because I think that's amazing. So you have giants and dragons and I don't know, like giant squids or something that are all 4-tile monsters, and also the big sailing ships, the 3-mast ships, are 4 tiles.
Yes,
and I think that just makes such a huge leap forward, because that's one of the big problems with a tile-based game is like a sword, a person, and a ship are all basically the same size. And, there's something just a little off about that. So I just love sailing around in my ship and, firing my cannon and stuff. It's so cool. And I feel like there's an appeal to these 8-bit games it goes way beyond nostalgia, that I feel like the, I don't know, just sort of it's the right level of abstraction for me for a role-playing game where I'm sailing my ship around and, like a storm goes by and there's monsters on the coast and I fire my cannon at them and stuff. And it takes 5 minutes or something, but in my head, I can tell myself a little story I can imagine all this stuff happening. Whereas with really advanced graphics, if you actually see every step that your character takes and every, cannon, loading the cannon and all that stuff, it just takes hours and hours. You just watch. So much of the game is spent not making meaningful decisions, but just watching animation cycles repeat over and over again. And I think about this a lot with games like fantasy, where you start the game and you walk you press the button 6 times and you're at the first dungeon. It's just like there's something a lot more snappy about the pace in a lot of ways. But let me go back to David. What do you think about that when you said you saw oh, there's this new game, Nox Archaist. What do you think the appeal is of a game like that in today's market?
I think it's sort of a gestalt appeal for me. It was not just my interest in playing a game, but it was in seeing someone or a team willing to go the extra mile and put out things like affiliates and buy a box product so that it felt like buying an Apple II game. And actually, I had a question for Mark.
Sure.
I thought it was really cool that you wrote the game in 6502. And I know a lot of retro style games. For example, Mega Man 9 from like 11 years ago now was written to resemble an NES game, but it actually did things that the original NES hardware couldn't do. And I don't believe that was the case with Nox Archaist because you wanted it to run on an Apple II. But was there anything you thought of that just wasn't possible to do on the Apple II, no matter how hard you all tried to make it happen?
Yes, there were definitely a number of things. And for every feature that made it in, that pushed the boundaries, there were definitely those that did not. And one example that comes directly to mind is, and it actually starts by describing something that we did do. We were able to make it so that NPCs were not hard nailed down to their specific a specific town, which was very much the case in 8-bit RPGs.
Yeah,
and we made it. You basically using state flags made it so that maybe you're talking to an NPC in the tavern in a town, and you're talking about the mines nearby, and the NPC hires you to provide security for the miners, and says well, here's where our mining camp is down in the dungeon. Well, the dungeon, the mine, but we know it's really a dungeon.
Yeah.
and then after that, you actually go into the mine and go to where you were told by the NPC to go, and suddenly the NPC is there in this mining camp in this this dungeon environment, and is not in the town. If you go back to the town and the tavern, they're gone after that. So we were able to get the concept of kind of event management integrated into the game to be able to get the world to react to the player in a way that was not the case in 8-bit games. And one thing that we couldn't do to answer your question directly is what I wanted really was for the player to be able to see that NPC walk out of the tavern and exit the town and walk over to the cave, and to kind of actually be able to observe the entire journey. And that was something that was just not possible, at least within the iteration of the engine as we built it. And ultimately, I think it probably is legitimately impossible without sacrificing so much of the other game components that it really just wouldn't be something that would make sense.
I think that's what's fascinating about endeavors like yours and others by these communities where they, you can think of a really cool idea, but you also have to weigh the limitations and, what, can we afford to sacrifice all this other stuff that is actually essential to, one system or another just because we want to make this really cool thing happen. And I think that's, for me, a hallmark of developing a retro or a retro style game is working within those limitations, because it does force you to make some sacrifices, but also it brings out a lot of creativity that maybe isn't as much in evidence today because we just have the spoil of riches in terms of resources and hardware and things like that.
I totally agree. And I think something that kind of comes along with that is the excitement and fun of exploration, and how that was so present in 8-bit role-playing games and is somewhat absent, I think, in the more modern games that are styled along the lines of, there's the question mark hovering over the head of the person that's the quest giver, and then you get a dash line that tells you where to go, and that being one of the more extreme examples, or the whole concept of fast travel, and you don't actually walk from town to town and things like that. And games where, even where you could, you wouldn't want to, because it might take a couple hours to walk across the world. And the ratio of time spent just randomly exploring to finding interesting things is just way off balance. Whereas in a 8-bit role-playing game, you can invest some time in just randomly exploring, which may or may not be because you're walking between towns or something. And, the frequency of finding something unique and interesting is high enough. I think that it makes that experience fun. Whereas in the modern games, because their worlds are so big, it's just not practical to and so many of them are also have a lot of programming, created content and things. It just becomes impractical, I think, in the business equation of those games to have an actual developer go in and create enough interesting things throughout the world that it's going to give that same sort of random exploration reward, experience.
Would Nox Archaist run on like a typical Apple II from 1987 or whatever, or would you need to have had like a totally tricked out Apple II to run the game?
I would say fairly typical. What really separates the Apple IIs is there's the ones with 128K and there's the ones that don't have 128K. And the reality actually is most of the systems produced do. The vast majority do. But at the time, developers tended to make their games they tended to make it so that their games would run on all of the platforms, like 100% of them, because that was just what made business sense. You don't want to cut off, a chunk of your market. And when they were doing it at the time, that was before the last Apple II, was produced. So they sort of had a different set of economics that they were dealing with it. But from a standpoint of today, the vast majority of Apple IIs will run it, and
So if you find a time machine, are you going to travel back to 1987 and just become king of the CRPG world?
Yeah, that's funny. That as fun as that would be, and I remember somebody asking me this once before. That I always think about how if I could literally do that would be great. But the reality is so much that I stood on the shoulders of giants in what I did. It's a lot easier to create something like Nox Archaist when you've seen what came before it. Each iteration of the Ultimas, each iteration of the Bard's Tale games and the Wizardries was better than the one before that. The developers learned from the experience, and they set new goals that stretched beyond what they did, and then solved to those and went through that process. And I had the advantage of seeing how it all played out, and could just kind of pick up where they left off and set those stretch goals out one or two notches further and go into it. But yeah, if I could just, like I said, time machine and take all the knowledge I had and go back to 1985 or something and totally screw up the space-time continuum in the process, sure, why not?
Well, so one of my favorite sort of Easter eggs in the game is you find this, in spoiler warning, sorry people, but what you find this room where you meet all these Apple II developers and things. And so let me just read the list. These are the characters you can interact with: Richard Garriott, Silas Warner, Steve Wozniak, Roger Wagner, Brian Fargo, Jordan Mechner, John Carmack, Dr. Cat, John Romero, Becky Heineman, and Robert Woodhead. So can you just quickly tell us, like, what, how did that room come to be in the game?
Sure. It was, it wasn't something really necessarily in the original plan. It came to be, I think it was kind of after our Kickstarter campaign. Prior to the Kickstarter campaign, I'd gotten in touch with Richard Garriott, and he graciously agreed to let us put Lord British in the game as an NPC, and then we launched our Kickstarter, and through the process of that, I started to get into contact with some other folks. Dr. Cat, notably, I think comes to mind in that process, And one thing kind to led to another, in talking to people and getting introduced to other people. And the idea just kind of naturally evolved at that point. And that, well, hey, I think that it would be fun to have a, reunion party with, these awesome people that are excited about Nox Archaist and chatting with me about it. And so I started asking, well, hey, would you like to? And, it was a great success. And I think to a person, everyone I asked was very excited and happy to participate. And then all I had to do is figure out how to squeeze out the memory and disk space for this somewhat substantial room that was not part of the original plan. But I thought, well, I'm going to chance it. That I can figure it out.
Well, so David, I mean, you must have interacted with most or all of those people on that list, right? You want to talk about what was your experience of interviewing them or getting in touch with them, stuff like that?
Yeah, it was really tough because since the Apple II was prevalent so early in the context of not just personal computers, but the games industry, a lot of Apple II developers made a game or two, maybe three for the Apple II, and then left the industry to get a quote-unquote real job. And so some of them, usually what I do is I'll meet one person who introduces me to two other people, who introduce me to five other people, and then it just kind of snowballs. The Rolodex grows from there. But I had to really hit up LinkedIn and look at people who hadn't made games maybe since their one hit for the Apple II, and kind of study up on them to learn where they worked before or after they put out an Apple II game and reach out to them on that basis. And once I did get a hold of them, though, people were very forthcoming. Talking to Richard Garriott was a ton of fun. I mean, you might have noticed those chapters were just crammed with details. Yeah. He opened up a lot about his childhood and what it was like to grow up with, a dad who had gone to outer space, and what it was like working in their family. Just being kind of a part of a community where, everyone's dad was affiliated with NASA or something similar. I would say that I tried to get a hold of Steve Wozniak, but his assistant let me know that he was too busy, maybe still recovering from Dancing with the Stars or something. But a personal highlight for me was talking with Jordan Mechner, who was really busy on movie stuff at the time, but Prince of Persia is one of my favorite games of all time. I had never actually played Karateka before I started writing Breakout. And so getting to talk to him, I mean, we had one conversation about Karateka and then a whole other on Prince of Persia, and he was also very forthcoming. I know he publishes journals, but I managed to ask him a lot of stuff that he actually didn't talk about in his journals and that jogged his memory. And so that was just a real highlight for me, getting to talk to someone who had such an influence on me personally and professionally.
Yeah, like Richard Garriott, like I said, I've read like 6 books about him, and there was still tons of stuff in your book that I'd never heard before. Like this whole thing about his mom selling the moon pots. Like, yeah, it was just like, just to explain quickly, since his dad was an astronaut and his mom was an artist, and she had made these, these pots that you would fire in a kiln that were shaped, sort of the surface was decorated like the moon, and they became incredibly popular, and the whole family was helping to make and glaze and fire them and everything. And I think they were selling them by the tens of thousands or something, all throughout.
They were, and that was also kind of, as you mentioned, a family project where his mom put together an assembly line of kids, and then Richard's dad, her husband, helped out a little bit, and it was a lot of people. That's the sort of thing where when you write a book, especially one that is not digital. Schiffer Publishing doesn't do digital books, so Breakout is still only available in hardcover. You might think that on the internet you have an unlimited page count, so of course that's the place to share those stories. But the problem with an unlimited page count is people have a very, very finite attention span because there's so much else out there competing for their time. So when you sit down with a book, you have kind of a different mentality of giving more of your focus and attention to the story you're reading. And, as I mentioned earlier, I want readers to get to know developers as people, because when you make a game for the Apple II or the Atari VCS or even the NES, these classic systems, the team sizes were very small, oftentimes being made by one person. And what that means is everything about that person or that small team, their personalities, the culture, their work environment, tends to leave a footprint in the game. And so in that story, I shared it because I wanted to not only show just how much of a factor Richard Garriott's family was on his games, but also just show that, hey, this is part of the culture, and he couldn't really have made these games any other way because this is just kind of his background and what he knows and how the family all kind of comes together to help each other.
Yeah. Also, you mentioned Steve Wozniak, and I just want to read this anecdote. This is someone in your book is talking about Steve Wozniak and says, Woz is a pretty interesting person. He was sort of the alpha nerd in a way. People would bet him. He would say, I can copy a floppy disk with a hot steam iron. And people would say, no way. He'd go bet. And then he would go off and try to do these things. And I just think that's such a great story. That just gives you such a vivid picture of him as a character.
It does. And it also illustrates why I wish Wozniak got a lot more credit for Apple's early successes than he does. I mean, he receives a tremendous amount, but when people think of Apple, they still think of Steve Jobs, even though he's been gone for almost 10 years, which is hard to believe. But really, the Apple Macintosh, the iMac, even the iPhone, none of that would have happened, I would argue, if not for the success of the Apple II. And what's unique about that is the Apple II was so different than the products Apple would make later and makes to this day. The Apple II, I talk about in my book how Woz and Jobs argued over giving users the ability to add more memory and to add cards to do other things, like hook up controller, joysticks, printers. And Steve Jobs said, no, I don't think that's necessary. And Woz said, look, we do this or you find yourself another alpha nerd, to paraphrase. And, the Apple II really was, I think I write about this in the epilogue, the fact that you could pop the hood, tinker with it, learn about it was such a huge influence. And then after that, the Mac, hugely influential, obviously, but it was also a black box. Really, I feel like the IBM PC compatible kind of picked up the torch that the Apple II lit and it's still carrying it today.
Yeah. Well, so Mark, so you got Woz to appear in your game, right? So how'd you pull that off?
Yeah, that was a intricate piece of networking, and I have to give credit to Roger Wagner for that. I'm not sure if that's a name that you guys are familiar with, but he wrote a column called Assembly Lines in, I think it was Nibble magazine, one of the big magazines back in the 80s, and he was the keynote speaker at Kansas Fest a couple of years ago, and I've been going to Kansas Fest every year for the last 5 years or so, and had the opportunity to meet him there, as well as one of my teammates, Chris Torrance, got to know him very well, and actually worked with Roger to publish a book called Assembly Lines, which is like a recompilation of all of his articles from the magazine days. And anyway, that led to when this reunion party room was coming together, and it was looking, like this is really going to be something special. We thought, well, we got to ask Woz, and so the natural thing to do was to reach out to Roger to see if he could make an introduction, get us in touch with Woz so that we could pitch Woz on being in this reunion room. And Roger was gracious enough to do that, and Steve Wozniak was gracious enough to take the time to not only agree to do it, but then when Nox Archaist launched in December, he tweeted out himself that he's an NPC in Nox Archaist on the computer they invented 40 years ago, et cetera, et cetera. And that absolutely just made my day, made my my year, my decade, whatever. That's for an Apple II, lifelong Apple II fan, for me, that's like getting a blessing from the Pope.
Well, I watched an interview with you. I forget if it was maybe the Lost Sectors show. It was one of those. But you were saying that you have undergone, from in your day job, you've undergone sort of this high-powered corporate training for networking and things. And that one of the tricks that you have learned is that when you're approaching somebody, you put in the subject of the email, like referral from so-and-so that you've been in touch with. And so if you're approaching Steve Wozniak, it would be like referral from, Richard Garriott or whatever. And then he would be like, oh, I know Richard Garriott. I'll read this email and see what it says.
That gets him to open the email, yes.
Yeah. But the point you made that I thought was so interesting is that, you can do like whole chains of these, kind of like David was talking about, where, you might have initially only known some very low level person and they introduced you to someone. And so like when you get to the like referral from Richard Garriott, you said the person doesn't know that it might be 10, it might be 10 chains down to the person that you actually personally knew initially. But they don't know that when they get your email. I thought that was a really clever bit of networking advice there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very effective. And in putting together the Apple II reunion party, I didn't have to get anywhere near 10 hops out, partially because several other people in the room, like John Carmack and Robert Woodhead, Berger Becky, they all actually backed the Kickstarter. So that made it easier to get in touch with them, and then also to get in touch with the others from there. But I did in one of my day job professional situations, I did actually get 10 hops out, one time, and which was the example I gave in Lost Sectors. So I did have the opportunity to confirm that there really isn't a limit to the number of hops that you go if you use effective networking techniques.
Yeah. I also thought, I've interviewed Matt Barton on this podcast, and I really like his Matt Chat show. And so I thought it was funny that he also appears as an NPC in the game.
Oh, yeah, that's great. It was really great to have Matt in there. And I had the opportunity to meet Matt through just, Nox Archaist was on his show. We were on his show doing a live stream a couple of years ago, while we were in still development, which of course was the result of some networking and introduction from another developer that had been on his show. But it was in the course of that that I had the opportunity to ask him if he'd like to be an NPC, and it worked out so great. I don't know if you've gotten to the point in the game.
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
You have not? Did you say?
No, I have. Yeah.
Oh, you have. Yeah. Some things just happen by chance. The quest that he gives to seek and slay the Rat King and bring back the Rat King's head, which is just so the quest that Matt Barton would give in a game. It just coincidentally, it was a quest created by one of our Kickstarter backers. Some of the Kickstarter tiers, the upper tiers, had game design rewards where you get to design an island or a room in a dungeon or something like that. And this particular backer that had one of those rewards decided to design an area of the game that had this mob called the Rat King, and it was like from some games that he had made as a kid or something. But when he submits that in, and at the same time I'm knowing that I hadn't created the Matt Barton NPC or even the town that he was in yet, it was like, oh, I just see this totally fitting together.
Yeah. Well, if people don't know, because Matt Barton, he talks about all these classic CRPGs, and the first monsters you always fight is you always go down in the dungeon and fight rats. And he's always like, why rats? But so it's kind of like a running joke he has. I guess, actually, Mark, are there any other sort of cameos in the game that I haven't mentioned there?
Oh, let's see. I think we've mentioned most of them. John Romero is in there. I mean, we may not have talked about him yet. He was really fun talking to him, and of course him graciously agreeing to be in the game. And but I think we've touched on everybody else.
Okay, cool. I mean, David, were there any other stories you wanted to tell about interacting with these Apple II designers or interacting with Apple II community? Have you ever been to Kansas Fest? Any of that kind of stuff?
I was actually going to go and give. I think I might have been up for a keynote to open it one year. Must have been 2018, but I had a scheduling conflict. But I would still like to go and actually not talk, because that's the part of writing and promoting that I like the least. I'm a bit shy. It would really be cool to just go and hobnob and just talk to all these people, meet them face to face. John Romero, used to throw these Apple II parties, and he talked about wanting to fly me out for the next one he does so I can meet a lot of these folks. Particularly because, on a more sobering note, a lot of these developers are passing away since all this happened so long ago. And that's actually why I was glad to get to talk to people like Doug and Gary Carlson, the co-founders of Broderbund, when I could, because they all have such fascinating, fun, and educational stories to tell, and it's pretty imperative to get them down on paper while you still can.
Are you planning to have you sort of said everything you have to say about Apple II in this book, or do you think you might write any more about the Apple II?
I might write a sequel, although I've been a full-time writer for almost 20 years, and one way I keep myself motivated is through wanderlust. I often don't tackle the same subject twice. Series kind of kill me. Like, people are like, when's Stay Well and Listen coming 3? Stay Well and Listen 3 coming out. And I'm like, oh, I have no idea. But I like to just write about a lot of different stuff. And so I got a lot of questions, similar questions about dungeon hacks and roguelikes. And the answer is maybe, but right now I'm definitely on other tracks.
Yeah. Well, so one thing I thought was interesting in your book was you said that you can actually play all these Apple II games pretty easily, that there's these websites that archive them, and there's all these emulators and stuff. Can you tell, like, if someone's like, oh, I used to play Karateka, it would be nice to take that out for a spin again. Like, what's the easiest way to get one of these games going these days?
Sure. There are a lot of virtual arcades that you can play just through web browsers, and I can't think of the names of any right now, and I don't want to type because that would, you don't want to hear my mechanical keyboard on the podcast. But if you really just type, play Apple II games online, I mean, within the first handful of results, you'll find all sorts of web emulators that will load the disks for you. They tell you the controls. I think some even have a save state option, so you don't have to deal with a lot of the very cumbersome save mechanics that games had back then. And you can just get up to speed and go. You can even, a lot of them let you choose the incarnation of the Apple II you want. You can play with the black and green monochrome monitors, or upgrade, so to speak, to an Apple TGS and play in bright, vivid color. So yeah, there's a ton of ways to play this game. And just kind of piggybacking on Mark's stories, the cool thing about talking with folks like John Romero, John Carmack, Richard Garriott and Berger Becky, these people just love that they were involved in this scene, are still active in it, and will talk to you, will walk you through anything you want to hear about. So, if anyone would ever have a question, play an Apple II game and then have a question for any of them, you can tweet at them, and 9 times out of 10, they'll get back to you within 12 hours or so and just talk your ear off about these days. It's pretty cool.
And and so everyone, definitely check out some of these old Apple II games because they're pretty cool still. Like Lode Runner, I think, is just an amazingly fun game. Yes. I mean, it's like, on this, it's like so many intelligent decisions you have to make and strategies you have to employ in this, using this very simple technology. But I don't know if and obviously definitely check out Nox Archaist. I mean, it's like so much fun. It really takes me back, like I said, to playing Rings of Zilfin and Fantasy and Ultima 4 and all these games. And I don't know if we've made this clear, but you don't have to have an Apple II to play it. So Mark, do you want to talk, say you don't have an Apple II, how do you play Nox Archaist?
Sure. Yeah, you can play it on a modern Windows, modern Mac computer, and just go to our website, noxarchaist.com, and you can get the game there, or even on Steam as of January 28th. If you're on Steam, just do a search for Nox Archaist. You'll be able to grab it there on whatever platform you're using Steam on.
Yeah, and I just want to, for people like me who didn't read the manual and everything and just jump into it, I just want to explain that, the game only has 2 save slots. And so you should definitely, in general, just use slot 1 if you're in town and slot 2 if you're out in the wilderness. Exactly. So that you don't get yourself stuck. But then also you can just make multiple folders and just copy all the game files into multiple folders. And then you'll have, as many save slots as you want. And so that's, I think, pretty important because there's a lot of ways you can get stuck definitely in the game. So it's good to have, a bunch of different save games going.
Yeah, that's exactly the technique I recommend.
Yeah. And I just want to mention one of the features of the game is quick combat, which I think is a underutilized option in role-playing games. I don't know if you ever played Wizard's Crown. That was the first.
I did.
I think that was the first role-playing game I ever played on a computer, and that has quick combat. And it's always stuck in my mind because it says in the manual something like, you might want to use quick combat for some of the later fights in the game, which can take upwards of 6 hours. It's also something like
wow.
that. That game was insane. But just do you want to talk just quickly about the quick combat?
Absolutely. One of the most frequent things that I heard from people interested in Nox Archaist was that while they liked the 8-bit role-playing games like Ultima, they did find the combat to get a bit grindy at a certain point. And I remember that myself. Was having enough fun overall. It didn't matter, but I can remember being like a top level party of characters, and I'm coming out of a dungeon just having grabbed a bunch of loot and experience, and I'm heading to town to sell the loot, and I get attacked by some low level mob like orcs or something. And that I'm just going to absolutely obliterate, but the game would make me go through a full-blown tactical combat and spend a couple minutes to, dispatch them. And it was an annoyance. And when I heard other people saying that, they felt that way too, and probably even much more strongly than I did. That's when I thought that a great way of pushing the boundaries on the tile RPG would be to have the tactical combat system that everybody expects, full screen tactical combat, but also in addition have a quick combat option that wouldn't be a substitute for tactical combat. You're not as likely to win battles in quick combat as you are in tactical, but if you're in a situation where you're way more powerful than the monster that just attacked you, quick combat, you can be done with that battle in seconds and moving on to the next thing. And it's really been something that even hardcore RPG players have said that it was a really wonderful quality of life enhancement.
Yeah. So definitely check out this game again. It's called Nox Archaist, and it's perfect if you remember these games like from the 80s. But also if you're a fan of modern RPGs and you've never played games going back to the 80s, it's a really good way, I think, to just sort of learn a bit of the history and see what the games used to be like and how they've developed without a lot of the frustrations that we dealt with back in the 80s, there were a lot of frustrations, and you can kind of get the good without the bad. So definitely check out the game because I've been having an absolute blast with it the last couple weeks. We're pretty much out of time, so I guess just Mark, do you have any final thoughts on just this whole phenomenon of Apple II games?
It's growing. The retro scene, retro gaming scene in general, inclusive of Apple II, is really on the rise. And now is a great time to kind of get in on this renaissance that's happening when not only can you enjoy playing the game, but you can interact with others that are playing these games at the same time. Nox Archaist has a Discord server, and there's other retro gaming Discord servers as well. And it's just a really great time to kind of get in on the nostalgic fun.
Absolutely. And so, David, final thoughts on Apple II games?
Yeah, they still mean a lot to me. These stories mean a lot to me. If you're interested in learning more, definitely check out Breakout. But if you really want to get up to your elbows in these games, I would recommend checking out Nox Archaist. It's a great love letter, I would say, to this era of gaming and the formative RPGs that all three of us spend a lot of time playing.
Absolutely. All right, so let's wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with David Lcraddick, author of Breakout, and Mark Lemmert, project leader on Nox Archaist. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having me as well. It was a great time.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to David Lcraddick and to Mark Lemmert for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.